Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Julie Allen.
And I'm Andrew Pryor. It is the week of March 20th, and this is your Monday briefing. The House and Senate are in session this week and next week before both chambers depart for a 2-week spring recess. Congressional hearings on the President's FY 2024 budget continue this week. On March 22nd, the Senate Finance Committee will hold a hearing with HHS Secretary Javier Becerra. Also this week, the Finance and Ways and Means Committee will hold a March 23rd and March 24th hearing on the President's trade agenda with USTR Katherine Tai. And the House Ways and Means Health Subcommittee will hold a March 23rd hearing on small business and healthcare affordability. Finally, the Federal Reserve holds a monetary policy meeting on March 21st and 22nd.
The Senate Finance Committee held a March 16th hearing on President Biden's budget with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Joining us to share his views on the hearing and other recent developments is Rohit Kumar. Rohit, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So Rohit, during the hearing, there was a lot of focus on the recent developments in the banking sector. Do you see that having an impact on the congressional agenda overall and specifically on the debt limits?
So I think there's going to be a lot of conversation about possible banking legislation, but I'm frankly pretty skeptical that anything is going to come together for two reasons. One, it's not clear, right now anyway, that any legislative proposals are really required. That the Fed and Treasury and that they don't already have the authorities that they need to address the issue. And I'm even more skeptical that you could find a bipartisan consensus, something that could pass a Republican House, a Democratic Senate, and get to the president's desk for signature. You've seen some members relitigating reforms from the Trump administration, but even Senate Democrats who voted for that legislation are not backing away from their support. So I just don't think there's overlap in the Venn diagram in terms of new banking regulatory kind of proposals. On the debt limit, frustratingly to me, the answer is I don't think it will influence the debt limit's sort of trajectory, even though I think it should, right? Because I think one thing that hypothetically Congress as a lesson should be learned from this exercise is this is what happens when the market kind of collectively decides rather quickly that this is no longer a credit-worthy institution and there's a sort of run on the bank, as it were. And so, it ought to, at some level, encourage Congress to act more quickly and not bump up against the deadline, not get as close to the X date as they are likely to get. But as a practical matter, I just don't think it's going to affect their thinking. I don't think they view themselves the same way. I think Congress views Treasury as a category of one and is sort of immune from these pressures. Whether that's true is maybe a separate question, but I think that's how they see it. And so while I think it should inspire a little bit of caution, I don't think it will.
So Rohit, clearly banking sector concerns were on display at the Senate Finance Committee hearing, but there were some tax discussions, OECD, the energy tax credits. What were your key takeaways on the tax policy issues from that Senate Finance Committee hearing?
Yeah, sort of two things. One, maybe not surprisingly, a lot of focus on all the green energy, clean energy credits. What is the definition of a free trade agreement? The chairman of the Finance Committee reminded Secretary Yellen, hey, by the way, we Congress decide what is a free trade agreement. You don't just get to designate, like a bilateral investment treaty as a trade agreement and then say you qualify under the sort of content requirements. So that's kind of Congress just asserting itself relative to the executive, which is not something that Congress has done a lot recently. So it's sort of, as someone who grew up on Capitol Hill, I'm kind of encouraged to see Congress saying, no, we have some jurisdiction here and you got to respect that. And then very much to my surprise, a lot of questions about the OECD Pillar 1, Pillar 2 projects. Several senators raised the issue, really focused narrowly on the issue that has kind of captured Congress's attention, which is the application of the UTPR, the undertax profits rule, the application of the UTPR to the domestic income of a U.S. headquartered multinational, i.e., is it possible that under this new regime that Treasury has signed up to, that a foreign government could say to a U.S. multinational, you're not paying enough tax in the U.S., despite our 21% corporate rate, and despite nobody thinks about the U.S. as a sort of tax haven, that you might be underpaying U.S. tax in the U.S. and therefore have residual liability in a foreign jurisdiction that effectively erodes some of the incentive effect of things like the R&D tax credit, the FDII incentive, the fact that state and local bonds provide tax-free interest income, those sorts of things. So you saw a lot of focus on that, and that's clearly both in the House and the Senate kind of captured Congress's attention, and we saw that on display at the hearing.
So Rohit, sticking on your 174 point, a lot of companies are interested in that. And a bipartisan group of senators just reintroduced the bill. So how does that fit into the overall effort to restore that 174 expensing?
so I view this as sort of the initial step. Like, you got to crawl before you walk, and you got to walk before you run. You got to get the bill introduced, and you have to show bipartisan support before you can think about what is the path to getting the bill signed into law. And the bill was introduced last week. It had 14 original sponsors and co-sponsors, 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans. That's actually more than they had 2 years ago, the last time they introduced this bill, when it had 4 at the sort of initial on bill introduction day. And that's actually, it's sort of encouraging in the sense that there was a little bit of negative pressure from Senate leadership, Senate Democratic leadership, on Senate Democrats to try to, maybe we try to make this more of a Republican ask, because we're going to ask for the child tax credit or something family oriented, but child tax credit's probably the thing. And so the more that we can make this a Republican thing, then the more leverage we have in the negotiation. And kind of despite that sort of gentle pressure, I don't want to overstate how much of it was there, you ended up with 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans on the bill when it was introduced last week. And so then, again, that's just the initial stage. They will eventually have to figure out what does the compromise look like. Not so much on 174, that's pretty straightforward. It's just a seamless extension. But what are the other things that have to travel with it? Is it something on the child tax credit? There are other proposals floating around, like 1099K reporting, 163J, bonus full expensing, things that emanate from the 2017 statute. So there are a bunch of things floating around, but the real logjam is, like, we're not just going to do a business tax title. There's going to be something for individuals. And what does that look like, and how do they get there? So that continues to be an issue. But again, it is significant that you had a bill introduced and it had such broad bipartisanship on first introduction.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing your insights specifically on 174 and on all these other recent developments.
Sorry, thank you.
Be sure to check out the latest Week in Review with Carl Russo, included in the description of this episode. And stay tuned for a special episode on the FASB exposure draft on income tax disclosure and this Friday's Week in Review.
And as always, thank you for spending this time with us. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.